Well, guess I was wrong. It was bound to happen sometime. I misremembered some dates and implied that this video would be about the Frisian freedom. I know. I'm disappointed in me too. There was just so much church talk in this video. Far more than I planned for. But hey, what did I expect? This is medieval Europe. Ever since people have lived in the Netherlands, they fought against the ever-encroaching sea. We've seen this in the first video of the series, where the Frisian built Terpen to live above the water. But the importance of Terpen waned from the 10th and 11th centuries onwards, as the Frisians found a new way of combating the sea: building dikes. There wasn't anything new about building dikes. Several cultures already had a history of dike building. Even Friesland had a long history of building them on a small scale. After the Frisian moved out, it took the Frisians a while to pick up the building of dikes, but after 950, it started to get back into fashion. For the construction of dikes on a larger scale, several villages would band together to build dikes around a certain area. The villages would fund and maintain the dikes collectively. These areas are called moederpolders. These moederpolders are also called islands. Friesland had about 6 of these moederpolders. Although many dikes were being built across modern Friesland, the trend of building them is thought to have started in Westergo. The inhabitants of this region were rich enough to afford the construction, and it supported a larger population, which would need more land to live on. The building of dikes also kicked off a cycle. First, the larger population needed more land to live on. So the inhabitants reclaimed more land. More land was available to live on, which led to a growth in population, and wouldn't you know it, the large population again needs more land to live on. Rinse and repeat. The moederpolders formed the base on which most diking was based on, as newer built dikes were almost always connected to these areas, especially in Westergo. Between the years 1000 and 1200, a huge amount of dikes, including seawalls, were constructed, roughly giving us the modern shape of the province. In the middle of Friesland, however, we see the Middelsee. It was a hook-shaped estuary that divided the old regions of Westergo and Eerstergo. As seen on the older maps, it started to take shape after Roman times. It started really small and gradually grew in size. It was fed by the river Bornmeer and the Marne, but when the sea reached its peak, it also started to split up again. This process was only exacerbated when the people of Bolsward broke the connection between the Middelsee and the Marne. Starting in the 11th century up until roughly 1250, the Frisians sped up the closing of the Middelsee by reclaiming land. Unlike the land reclamation we've talked about so far, the land reclaimed from the Middelsee was actually new land, instead of just drying up tidal areas. This led to the region being known as the Nieuwe Land, or the New Lands in English. However, depending on how big you define the Middelsee, the process of poldering didn't stop until 1754, with the completion of a build. So far, we've talked about Frisians beating the sea, but sometimes the good guys don't win. This happened from around the end of the 12th and throughout the 13th century, when a large amount of tidal surges hit the lowlands. First was the All Saints flood of 1170. The sea smashed through the water between Texel and mainland Holland, called the Vlie. It sank the Kreiler Woods located here, widening the strait where the Almere lake would enter the sea. The St. Nicholas flood of 1196 entered Friesland through the Middelsee, and in some areas the water stood almost a meter above the ground level. It also widened up the Vlie even more. Then came the St. Marcellus flood of 1219. The most destructive effect of this flood was when the water receded. It took with it large chunks of dikes. More tidal surges happened in these years. But the most impactful and disastrous was the St. Lucia's flood of 1287. The water violently rose over the dikes, and many people and animals died. Sources say that 50,000 people died in the northern coast of the lowlands. Although these numbers are probably an exaggeration, the flood was disastrous. Almost 30 towns in East Frisia alone disappeared beneath the waves. West Friesland also yielded large chunks of land to the water. West Friesland, now being completely shut off from the rest of Friesland, was swiftly taken by the Count of Holland. When these tidal surges receded, they took with them the soil of the former tidal areas. This gave the lowlands her 2 inland seas, the Zuiderzee and the Waddenzee, with her 2 bays, the Lauwerzee and the Dollard. So from now on, I will mainly be using this map in the video. But speaking of the County of Holland, that brings us to... There's a question we should ask ourselves. Who was in charge of Friesland during the High Middle Ages? Answer: Well, no one really. Officially, it would be the Holy Roman Emperor. Who was he? Well, technically he was the heir to Charlemagne's empire, and depending on who you ask, he was the heir to the Roman Empire. But the Count of Holland reckoned that he should rule it in the emperor's name. See, the Counts of Holland were actually called the Counts of Frisia, until Floris II. Yeah, it's a little confusing, I know. But why wasn't he in charge? Well, first off, the Count's domains would have been split by the Vlie. Also, the Frisians didn't want to be ruled by the Count. So in reality, the Counts of Holland only controlled these parts. And, well, yeah, eventually West Friesland as well. Another complication was a church. See, in the Middle Ages, Utrecht was ruled by the Bishop of Utrecht. So was Overijssel and Drenthe, back then known as Oversticht. But the diocese, the area where the bishop had spiritual dominion over, covered almost all the modern-day Netherlands. So he thought, hey, this means I have right to all this land. Ah, the Catholic Church, always making medieval history complicated. This came to a head in the 11th century, when they bickered endlessly about who had the rights to the land in Friesland, until they stopped bickering, and around 1165, they came to a compromise in which they both had the rights to the land, which actually meant that no one was really in charge. Just a little side note here, there was actually a county of Middle Frisia from roughly 1006 to 1088. This county was led by the Brunone dynasty, but the county only existed during the beginning of the High Middle Ages, and it isn't very relevant to the other topics in the video. So I will be talking a bit more about them in the next video. In the early Middle Ages, recently Christianized Frisian nobility granted a lot of land to imperial abbeys such as Echternach, Fulda and Werden, in hopes of getting a prime seat in heaven. This happened quickly after the Frankish conquest in 734. However, during the High and Late Middle Ages, the foreign abbeys would grant more and more land to Frisian cloisters and parishes. Speaking of cloisters, that brings us to... This first part might be a bit dry since I will be explaining what a parish is, so please stick with me here. The organization of the Catholic Church goes by dioceses, each with a bishop, but a diocese is further subdivided into parishes. A parish is the local community that is tied to one church. A parish is headed by a pastor. He was in charge of special things, like baptisms, marriages, and burials. The regular stuff could be done by any old church. Building a church can be a bit pricey, and people need things to live. This was fixed in two ways. One was a measure that was brought over here by Charlemagne from ye olden Roman times, the tithe, or tiendenplicht in Dutch. This meant that every person living in the parish had to donate a tenth of their income. The second fix was that a parish church would not be consecrated unless there were two full-on farms donated to the church, one for the upkeep of the church and one for the pastor himself. Now, that was all fairly standard. You can just slap the story on any region in Western Europe. But here is where it gets interesting and a little unique in Friesland. There was an excessive amount of parishes in medieval Frisia. By the year 1500, the modern province of Friesland had about 350 parishes, of the roughly 1600 in the entire diocese of Utrecht. That's a little under a quarter of the parishes for only a seventh of the land. And I can hear you all thinking, how did this happen? Well, I'm gonna tell you why. I mean, why else would I bring it up? It was very normal for parishes to be split up for several reasons. For example, the growth in population meant there were too many people for one pastor, more land was reclaimed, or because of local politics. So let's take the old parish of Jorvert as an example. This was the area that was part of Jorvert's parish at first. During the 13th century, the aforementioned foreign abbeys distanced themselves from their Frisian properties. And between years 1000 and 1300, almost 10 parishes split from this already relatively small parish. Why? Well, this had everything to do with local politics, as some parishes, like Lens, had only 6 to 7 farms under its territory. See, if you're an influential local noble, wouldn't it be great to give your brother or other friends a cushy job? Boy, it sure would be. But the local parish already has a pastor. Aww. But what if, hear me out, you would create a new parish? Yeah. But then again, the pastor, wanting to hold on to as much influence for himself, might not really like that. He is doing what? I heard you were busy making a parish out here in totally historically accurate Yellem. Just so you know, I'm making sure you get as little territory as possible. Aww. But wouldn't it be nice if you could give your brother a cushy job? Boy, it sure would be. Please stop. And repeat this 10 times until you get this hot mess. Going back to cloisters, By 1500, about 50 cloisters owned a fifth of the modern province's land. Now that's a lot of fifths. So it's not weird to imagine that they wielded a lot of influence. The cloisters of Klaarkamp and Mariëngaarde were the two most important cloisters. They owned numerous estates, churches, and even houses and properties in cities. The Sint Bernard cloister in Aduard in modern-day Groningen was one of the most prestigious cloisters in the Netherlands in its heyday. Like most cloisters, Frisian cloisters had two types of monks: normal brothers, who did what you expect monks to do, like pray and sing and stuff, and they were often ordained priests. And lay brothers, who followed the monastic principles and guidelines, for example chastity, but whose role was focused on manual labor. In most cloisters, 3 of every 4 brothers would be a lay brother. Their tasks included, but were not limited to, farming the massive properties of the cloisters, digging up peat, and building dikes. Speaking of church stuff, that brings us to... Yeah, that seems to be my thing this video, please just roll with it. First, some little background history. At the end of the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire lost the battle at Manzikert and was in some tough waters as the Sultanate of Rum took over most of Anatolia. Emperor Alexios Komnenos decided to ask the Pope for help. The beacons of Constantinople! The beacons are lit! Byzantium calls for aid. And Rome will answer. And use this to its own benefit. Pope Urban declared the very first crusade in 1095, and several, primarily French, nobles took up arms to liberate the Holy Land. If you want to see the dumpster fire that was the first crusade, check out this extra credits video. But long story short, against the wishes of all leaders of the first crusade, a large mob of peasants went first and mucked things up. The actual Crusader army followed, captured a small bit of territory for Alexios, and once they reached modern-day Syria, they betrayed him and took the eastern coast of the Mediterranean for themselves, as the Crusader states. After a few years, the Muslims managed to recapture Jerusalem, and several crusades were called to defend the Crusader states and retake Jerusalem. Again, though they didn't succeed in this, they did manage to save the Crusader states. So, there's that. Although the Frisians were actually present in nearly all crusades, they weren't even present in enough numbers to be shown as belligerents on the Wikipedia pages of most crusades, but they really stood out in their participation of the 5th Crusade. Thanks to the massive growth in cloisters and churches during the 12th century, more Frisians answered the call when the 5th Crusade started in 1213. Pope Innocent III declared, as was usual, to grant indulgences to all those who either joined or financially supported the crusade. An indulgence would clear a person of all their sins. Most kings were either not a big fan of another crusade, were dealing with their own trouble on the home front, or had bad blood with the Pope. So the Pope couldn't count on their support. So he would kick this one off with a massive PR campaign. The Pope also determined that the papacy should lead this crusade, since the last crusade didn't, well, let's just say that didn't go great. The Frisians that joined the crusade went by sea and were joined by crusaders from Holland and the Rhineland. See, for the most part, the crusaders from the lowlands weren't knights, and so they didn't wear heavy armor and did not use horses like their Frankish and German counterparts. Instead, they wore less expensive armor and traveled by ship. An interesting note, even though the various Frisian subgroups were split geographically and politically, they still chose to be led by the same subcommanders. When all was in order, the fleet set off in 1217 for the Holy Land. On their way over, the fleet stopped in Lisbon. Here, the Portuguese tried to persuade the Crusaders to take a nearby city from the Muslims. But the Frisians decided to say no. They didn't want to take the city because the Pope's indulgences didn't extend to fighting in Iberia, since he wanted Europe to fully focus on the Middle East. But the non-Frisian parts of the army did take the city, and then the fleet continued on, and eventually arrived in the Levant. The main focus of the 5th Crusade was Egypt instead of the Holy Land, in order to try and weaken the Muslim enemies of the remaining Crusader states. The Frisians were a big part of this crusade's primary engagement, the siege of Damietta. In May of 1218, the Crusaders set sail from Acre to Egypt. Their target was Damietta, as the city was instrumental in controlling the Nile River, and would be used as a base for a pincer move to retake Jerusalem. But Damietta was heavily fortified. The harbor was protected by a large chain between 2 towers. The Frisians created a makeshift siege tower by tying 2 cogs together and building a tower on top of it. Soon, the Egyptians in the tower surrendered. But the Crusaders still had trouble storming the city, so the siege endured for a year. But with a lack of supplies, the city fell. But when the Crusaders finally entered the city, they discovered that 5/6 of the city had perished due to famine. The Egyptian Sultan Al-Kamil offered a trade, Damietta for Jerusalem and a 30-year truce. Although the Crusaders themselves were tempted by the offer, the papal legate Pelagius that led the crusade refused. He wanted to take Jerusalem by force. Well, tough luck for Pelagius. 2 years after the fall of Damietta, he took his army to capture Cairo, but Al-Kamil's forces shadowed him. Pelagius was halted by the annual flooding of the Nile, and they were forced to turn back. But during his retreat, the Egyptian army constantly harassed him. You suck! No, not that kind of harassment. Yeah, that kind of harassment. After a few skirmishes, Pelagius was forced to surrender. Pelagius was forced to trade Damietta for his and his soldiers' lives, and an 8-year truce. The 5th Crusade was a failure. But hey, at least they captured that city for Portugal, so there's that. Well, that's kind of a low note to end on, unless you were Al-Kamil. Anyway, I promise you next time we will talk about the Frisian freedom. And maybe we'll talk about some Frisian-Dutch wars that actually resulted in the annexation of West Friesland. But in the meantime, please leave a like, comment, and press the subscribe button. And click the bell icon to get notified when the next video is uploaded. And have a good one. See you all next time.